Imagine standing in the absolute center of the Sahara Desert, not at the edges where the occasional scrub bush clings to life, or where a distant mountain range offers the faintest hope of shade. No, you are standing in the deep interior, in a place where the nearest paved road is 300 miles behind you and the nearest city might as well exist on another planet entirely. The sun is directly overhead. It is not warm. It is not hot. It is violent. The heat presses down on you with a physical weight, like a hand pushing against the top of your skull, squeezing the moisture from your skin before your sweat glands can even begin to do their work. The air temperature is 130 degrees Fahrenheit in the direct sun, and the sand beneath your feet is even hotter than that, hot enough to blister exposed skin in seconds, hot enough to cook an egg if you cracked one onto the surface and waited 3 minutes. The air shimmers and writhes above the dunes, creating false lakes on the horizon, phantom bodies of water that vanish the moment you stagger toward them. Mirages, the cruelest trick the desert plays on a dying mind. There is no sound here. That is one of the things that people who have never visited the deep Sahara do not understand. It is not just quiet. It is the total, suffocating absence of sound. No birds call because there are no birds. No insects hum because there are no insects. No wind rustles through leaves because there are no leaves, and sometimes there is no wind at all. In those moments of perfect stillness, the silence becomes a pressure inside your ears, a ringing emptiness that feels less like peace and more like the universe holding its breath. You could scream at the top of your lungs, and the sound would travel maybe 50 feet before the sand swallowed it whole. The Sahara does not echo. It absorbs. It takes everything you give it, your water, your energy, your voice, your hope, and it gives absolutely nothing back. This is the largest hot desert on the face of the earth. 3.5 million square miles of rock and sand and gravel stretching from the Atlantic coast of Mauritania all the way to the Red Sea shores of Sudan. It is roughly the size of the entire United States of America. You could drop the whole of Europe into it and still have room left over along the edges. In some regions, rain has not fallen in recorded memory. There are weather stations in the Libyan interior that have operated for decades without ever recording a single measurable drop of precipitation. Not one. The ground is so dry in places that geologists have compared it to the surface of Mars, and they are not exaggerating. Satellite analysis of certain Saharan rock formations reveals moisture content so low that it is functionally identical to Martian soil samples collected by robotic rovers millions of miles away. This is not a place where life struggles. This is a place where life surrendered a long time ago and never came back. If you were standing here with no water, no shelter, no vehicle, your survival would be measured in hours, not days. Hours. Dehydration in the deep Sahara can kill a healthy adult in as little as 6 to 8 hours under peak sun. Your body would lose water faster than your kidneys could conserve it. Your blood would thicken. Your heart would labor to pump the increasingly viscous fluid through your veins. Your core temperature would rise past 104 degrees, then 106. Your brain would begin to swell inside your skull. And then, quietly, without drama, your organs would shut down one by one, and the sand would begin the slow, patient work of burying you. To look at this landscape, to feel the crushing emptiness of it pressing in from every direction, the most natural assumption in the world is that this is how it has always been. That the Sahara is a permanent geological feature, as fixed and eternal as the Atlantic Ocean or the Himalayan mountains. That it has been a wasteland since the beginning of time and will remain one until the sun expands and swallows this planet whole. Every instinct you have, every piece of visual evidence before your eyes, tells you that nothing has ever lived here. Nothing could ever live here. This is a dead zone, a void, the end of the world. But every single one of those instincts is wrong. Because if you could somehow peel back time, if you could stand in this exact spot and rewind the clock by just 10,000 years, which in geological terms is less than the blink of an eye, you would not recognize this place. The sand would be gone. The silence would be gone. The death would be gone. In its place, stretching to every horizon, you would see a world so lush, so impossibly alive, so thunderously loud with the sounds of water and animals, and wind through tall grass, that you would assume you had been transporting to an entirely different continent. You would be standing in a paradise. A vast, sprawling, green empire of lakes and rivers and forests and savanna teeming with millions of animals and tens of thousands of human beings who built settlements, who hunted hippopotamuses, who fished in waters that no longer exist, who buried their dead with flowers in their hands, and who mapped the stars with stone circles older than the pyramids. An entire civilization thrived right here, right where you are standing, in a world that has been so completely and utterly erased that for thousands of years, modern humanity refused to believe it had ever existed at all. This is the story of the Green Sahara and the empire the sands swallowed. And to understand how it was born, we have to look up, far above the clouds, far above the atmosphere, into the cold mechanics of orbital space, where an invisible wobble in the way our planet spins around its axis quietly, slowly, without anyone noticing, rearranged the climate of an entire continent. The Earth does not spin through space in the clean, stable, perfectly predictable way that most people imagine. We learn in school that the planet tilts on its axis at 23.5 degrees, that this tilt gives us our seasons, and that the whole system operates like a well-oiled clock, reliable, unchanging, eternal. But that picture is a simplification. The truth is far messier and far more consequential. The Earth wobbles. Not dramatically, not in a way you could ever feel standing on its surface, but over thousands of years, the axis along which the planet spins traces a slow, lazy circle through space, like the stem of a spinning top that has begun to lose its perfect balance. Scientists call this precession, and the full cycle takes roughly 26,000 years to complete. It is so slow that no human civilization has ever existed long enough to witness more than a fraction of it. But the effects of that wobble are staggering. 26,000 years might sound like an abstraction, a number too large to mean anything real, but consider what it actually changes. Right now, in our current moment, the northern hemisphere happens to be tilted slightly away from the sun during the part of Earth's orbit when we pass closest to it. That means our northern summers, while warm, are not as intense as they theoretically could be. The difference is subtle, measured in the amount of solar energy hitting each square meter of ground, but subtle differences in solar energy are the things that build and destroy entire climate systems. 11,000 years ago, the wobble was in a completely different position. The northern hemisphere was tilted directly toward the sun at the point of closest orbital approach. Northern summers received significantly more solar radiation than they do today, not enough to burn the planet. Not enough to cause some Hollywood catastrophe, but enough, over decades and centuries, to fundamentally rearrange the atmospheric circulation patterns of the entire African continent. Here is what that rearrangement looked like in practice. The extra solar energy pouring onto North Africa during summer months heated the ground to extreme temperatures. Hot ground heats the air directly above it. Hot air rises. When massive volumes of air rise rapidly over a continent-sized area, they create a deep, powerful low-pressure system, essentially a void in the atmosphere that surrounding air rushes in to fill. And where does the surrounding air come from when you are sitting at the latitude of the Sahara? It comes from the south and the west. It comes from the tropical Atlantic Ocean, where the water is warm and the air is heavy, saturated, dripping with moisture accumulated over thousands of miles of open sea. This moisture-laden air, pulled northward by the low-pressure vacuum over the superheated Sahara, is the West African monsoon. Today that monsoon reaches only as far north as the Sahel, the narrow belt of semi-arid grassland that separates the green tropics from the desert. But 11,000 years ago, with the orbital wobble pumping extra energy into the system, the monsoon pushed hundreds of miles further north than it does today. It pushed into the deep Sahara. It pushed into places where rain had not fallen in tens of thousands of years. And when it arrived, it did not come gently. These were not soft spring showers drifting over the dunes. These were monsoon rains, tropical downpours of staggering intensity, the kind of rainfall that turns the air into a solid wall of water and reduces visibility to zero. Sheets of rain hammered the ancient rock and sand for weeks at a time during the summer months. And the desert, which had been baking in dry silence for millennia, had no idea what to do with it. The sand could not absorb it fast enough. The rock beneath was impermeable in many places, sealed tight by thousands of years of mineral deposits. So the water pooled. It gathered in depressions and ancient river channels that had been dry since before modern humans existed. Small pools became ponds. Ponds became lakes. Lakes merged and expanded and deepened year after year as the rains kept coming, kept pouring, with a reliability that made it seem like they would never stop. The largest of these new bodies of water defied belief. In the basin of what is today the nation of Chad, an enormous depression in the landscape began to fill, and it kept filling, and it kept filling. Over centuries, this basin accumulated so much water that it became one of the largest freshwater lakes on the planet. Scientists call it Mega Chad, and at its maximum extent, it covered approximately 150,000 square miles of surface area. To put that in perspective, that is larger than the entire nation of Germany. It is larger than all 5 of the modern North American Great Lakes combined. It held enough water to rank among the largest lakes that have ever existed on Earth at any point in geological history. And Mega Chad was not alone. Across the Sahara, in basins and depressions and ancient tectonic troughs, dozens of other lakes formed simultaneously. Some were modest, covering a few hundred square miles. Others were enormous in their own right. A chain of interconnected lakes and wetlands spread across what is now Libya, Algeria, Niger, and Mali, linked by rivers and seasonal flood channels that created a vast, labyrinthine network of waterways stretching thousands of miles across a region that today receives less rainfall annually than the driest town in Arizona. The Sahara had become a water world, a land of lakes and rivers and marshes and seasonal floods, fed by a monsoon engine that showed no signs of slowing down. And where there is water, on this planet life follows. It follows quickly, it follows aggressively, and it follows on a scale that can transform an entire landscape within a single human generation. The transformation began at the edges. The first grasses were pioneers, tough, wiry species with deep root systems evolved to survive in marginal conditions, the kind of plants that can find moisture 6 feet underground and pull it to the surface through sheer biological stubbornness. They appeared in patches at first, scattered clumps of green erupting from the sandy soil wherever runoff from the monsoon rains lingered long enough to soak the ground. But those patches spread. They connected. Within decades, what had been isolated tufts of green merged into continuous carpets of grassland that stretched for miles across the formerly barren landscape. And as the grasses took hold, they changed the soil itself. Their roots broke apart compacted sand and rock, creating pores and channels that allowed rainwater to penetrate deeper. Dead grass decomposed into organic matter, darkening the pale sand into something that began to resemble actual earth. Bacteria and fungi colonized this new soil, building the microscopic networks that make plant life possible on a large scale. The feedback loop was extraordinary. More plants meant better soil. Better soil meant more water retention. More water retention meant more plants. The desert was not just greening. It was building itself a living skin, one layer at a time, and each layer made the next one possible. The grasses were only the beginning. As the soil deepened and the water table rose, shrubs appeared. Thorny acacias, the iconic flat-topped trees of the African savanna, began to dot the grasslands. Gallery forests, dense ribbons of tall trees, grew along the banks of the new rivers and lake margins, their canopies providing shade and shelter and dropping leaves that enriched the soil further. In wetter areas, particularly around the shores of the Great Lakes, dense stands of papyrus and reeds grew to heights of 15 feet or more, creating impenetrable walls of vegetation along the waterline. The landscape was layering itself, building complexity. Open grassland gave way to scattered woodland, which gave way to dense forest along the waterways, which gave way to reed beds and marshes at the lake edges, which gave way to open water. Each zone supported different species. Each zone created different opportunities, and the animals came to fill every single one of them. They came from the south, from the tropical forests and savannas of Central and Western Africa, where large animal populations had persisted throughout the Ice Age. They followed the expanding grasslands northward as the monsoon pushed the green frontier deeper and deeper into former desert. The migration was not a single dramatic event. It happened over centuries, a slow, steady northward creep of species after species tracking the advancing vegetation. But the result was the creation of one of the richest large animal ecosystems that has existed anywhere on this planet in the last 100,000 years. Elephants came first, or nearly first, because elephants are superbly adapted to colonizing new territory. They can travel enormous distances. They can eat almost any vegetation. They can dig for water with their tusks. And critically, elephants are ecosystem engineers. When a herd of elephants moves through a landscape, they transform it. They knock down trees, which opens the canopy and lets light reach the ground, promoting grass growth. They dig water holes in dry riverbeds, which fill with groundwater and become drinking sources for dozens of other species. They trample paths through dense brush, creating trails that other animals follow. The elephants helped build the Green Sahara as much as the rain did. Behind the elephants came the grazers, herds of aurochs, the massive wild cattle that stood 6 feet tall at the shoulder, with horns spanning 3 feet from tip to tip. Enormous African buffalo, temperamental and dangerous, moving in groups that numbered in the hundreds. Several species of antelope, from the tiny dik-dik to the massive eland, each specializing in a slightly different type of grassland or browse. Giraffes appeared, browsing the high branches of the acacias that the shorter animals could not reach. Hippopotamuses colonized the lakes and rivers in enormous numbers, spending their days submerged in the cooling water and emerging at night to graze on the lush shoreline grass, consuming up to 80 pounds of vegetation per animal per night. Crocodiles followed the water, establishing themselves in the lakes and rivers as apex aquatic predators, some growing to lengths that would dwarf any crocodile alive today. The predators came last, as predators always do, because they needed the prey populations to establish themselves first. Lions appeared on the grasslands, forming prides that hunted the aurochs and antelope, just as their descendants hunt wildebeest and zebra on the Serengeti today. Leopards haunted the gallery forests, ambushing prey from the trees. Hyenas, both spotted and the now extinct giant short-faced species, scavenged and hunted in organized packs across the open country. Wild dogs coursed through the tall grass in disciplined groups, running down prey through sheer endurance. The skies filled too. Massive flocks of waterbirds descended on the lakes, flamingos in concentrations that would have turned entire shorelines pink, pelicans diving for the abundant fish, eagles and vultures riding the thermals above the savanna, scanning for prey or carrion below. The rivers and lakes themselves teemed with fish, including Nile perch that grew to extraordinary sizes in the warm, nutrient-rich waters, and several species of catfish and tilapia that provided an almost inexhaustible food source for any creature capable of catching them. This was the Green Sahara at its peak, not a tentative, struggling ecosystem clinging to marginal conditions, but a roaring, thundering, fully realized world of megafauna and predators and vast herds moving across grasslands under a sky full of birds. It was an ecosystem that rivaled or exceeded the modern Serengeti in its density and diversity of large animal life. And it existed in a place that today would kill every single one of those animals within days. But this paradise was not empty of the one species that would leave the most enduring mark on it. Somewhere in this green immensity, walking along the lake shore, watching the herds, crafting tools from stone and bone, a group of humans was about to arrive who would make this world their own. The first humans to settle the Green Sahara in significant numbers arrived roughly 10,000 years ago, during the peak of the African humid period, when the monsoon rains were at their strongest and the lakes were at their deepest. They came from the south and the east, following the same expanding grasslands that had drawn the elephants and the aurochs and the lions before them. But unlike those animals, who moved into the new territory purely on instinct, these humans came with intention. They came with technology. They came with the accumulated knowledge of thousands of generations of survival in harsh environments. And they came with a physical presence that would have stopped you in your tracks if you had been standing on that ancient lake shore watching them approach. We call them the Kiffians, a name derived from archaeological sites in the region, and the first thing you need to understand about them is their size. These were not the small, wiry, calorie-conserving people that harsh environments typically produce. The Kiffians were enormous. Skeletal analysis of their remains reveals that adult males routinely stood between 6 feet 2 inches and 6 feet 8 inches tall. Some individuals exceeded even that. Their bones were dense, thick-walled, and heavily marked with muscle attachment sites, the kind of skeletal architecture that only develops under a lifetime of intense, sustained physical activity. Their jaws were massive and powerfully muscled. Their skulls were robust, with pronounced brow ridges and wide cheekbones. If you stood one of these men next to a modern professional football linebacker, the Kiffian would look him in the eye and outweigh him. These were not people who lived on the edge of starvation. These were people who ate phenomenally well, who engaged in demanding physical labor from childhood through old age, and whose bodies reflected a lifetime of abundant nutrition and relentless activity. Their size was a direct product of their environment and their diet. The Green Sahara, particularly around the Great Lakes, offered a food supply that was almost obscenely abundant. The lakes teemed with enormous fish. Nile perch, some of which grew to 6 feet in length and weighed over 400 pounds, were the apex predators of these inland seas, but below them in the food chain were vast populations of tilapia, catfish, and other species that schooled in the shallows in numbers that defied counting. The shallows and marshes around the lake margins were home to enormous concentrations of turtles, many of which grew to substantial sizes in the warm, nutrient-rich waters. Hippopotamuses wallowed in the deeper sections, and while hunting a hippo was extraordinarily dangerous, a single successful kill could feed a large group of people for days. On the shores and the surrounding grasslands, game was everywhere. Aurochs, antelope, warthogs, ostriches, the protein sources were essentially limitless. The Kiffians adapted to this aquatic paradise with remarkable ingenuity. They were first and foremost fishers, not casual occasional fishers who dangled a line when they had nothing better to do, but dedicated, technologically sophisticated aquatic hunters who built their entire economy around the exploitation of the lakes. They crafted harpoons from animal bone, carefully shaped and barbed, so that once driven into the flesh of a large fish or a hippo, they could not be pulled free. These harpoon points were attached to lines made from plant fiber or animal sinew, allowing the hunter to strike from a distance and then hold on while the animal fought and exhausted itself. The design was elegant and effective, the product of generations of refinement. They also created fish hooks from bone, some surprisingly delicate and precisely shaped, suggesting that they fished with lines for smaller species as well as harpooning the giants. There is evidence of net weights, smooth stones with grooves carved around their circumference so that cord could be tied securely, suggesting the use of weighted nets to trap schooling fish in the shallows. Their settlements clustered along the lake shores and the banks of the major rivers, positioned for maximum access to the water that was the foundation of their existence. These were not temporary camps hastily thrown together and abandoned after a few weeks. Archaeological evidence suggests semi-permanent occupations, places where people returned season after season, year after year, building up deep layers of discarded fish bones, broken tools, ash from cooking fires, and the general domestic debris that accumulates wherever human beings stay long enough to call a place home. They processed their catches on site, and the sheer volume of fish bone in some of these middens is staggering, representing thousands upon thousands of individual fish consumed over centuries of continuous habitation. But the Kiffians were not just efficient hunters and fishers. They were also thinking, feeling, ritualizing beings who invested their world with meaning that went far beyond the simple calculus of calories and survival. They adorned themselves with jewelry made from hippo ivory and polished stone. They created tools that were not merely functional but aesthetically refined, shaped with a care and attention to form that went beyond what utility alone demanded. And most importantly, most revealingly, they buried their dead. They did not simply leave corpses to scavenge or toss them into the lake. They placed them deliberately in the earth, in positions that suggest ritual significance, accompanied by objects that suggest belief in some form of continued existence beyond death. This matters because it tells us something crucial about who these people were. They were not just surviving, they were living. They were creating culture, meaning, identity. They were building a civilization on the shores of lakes that would one day cease to exist, and they had no way of knowing that every trace of everything they built would eventually be swallowed by an ocean of sand. But that story, the story of what they left behind and how we found it, begins not in the deep Sahara, but in the mind of a half-mad Hungarian aristocrat with a fascination for blank spaces on maps. Laszlo Olmosy was born into minor Hungarian nobility in 1895, and from the earliest years of his life, he exhibited the particular brand of restless, obsessive curiosity that makes a person either a great explorer or a spectacular corpse. By the 1920s, he had become fascinated with the Sahara, specifically with the enormous blank spaces on the maps of the Libyan desert, the vast, featureless expanse stretching across the borders of Egypt, Libya, and Sudan, where European cartographers had simply given up and written nothing at all. Those blank spaces called to him the way sirens called to sailors. He wanted to know what was in them. He wanted to put his name on the empty places. In 1932, Olmosy organized an expedition to the Gilf Kebir, a massive sandstone plateau rising out of the desert floor in the extreme southwest corner of Egypt. The Gilf Kebir is one of the most inhospitable places on the surface of the earth. It sits in the middle of what meteorologists call the arid hyperzone, a region where annual rainfall is not merely low, but effectively zero. The plateau itself is a labyrinth of deep, narrow canyons carved by water that flowed millions of years ago, their walls rising hundreds of feet above the canyon floors in sheer, sun-blasted cliffs of pale stone. Nothing grows there. Nothing lives there. The silence is so complete that the sound of your own breathing becomes uncomfortably loud, as if the rocks themselves are listening. Olmosy drove into this wasteland in a battered automobile, accompanied by a small team of British and Egyptian companions, following rumors and fragmentary reports from Bedouin traders who claimed that somewhere in the canyons of the Gilf Kebir there were paintings on the walls. Paintings made by people who had lived there long ago, when the world was different. Most serious academics at the time dismissed these reports as fantasy. The idea that anyone had ever lived in the deep Libyan desert seemed absurd. But Olmosy was not a serious academic. He was an adventurer, and adventurers follow rumors. What he found in those canyons stopped him cold. On the walls of a shallow rock shelter, protected from the worst of the sun and wind by an overhanging ledge of sandstone, were paintings. Dozens of them, hundreds of them, painted in red and yellow ochre and white pigment directly onto the smooth stone surface, preserved by the extreme aridity that had kept moisture from degrading the mineral pigments for thousands of years. The images were vivid and unmistakable. There were giraffes, painted with a fluid naturalism that captured the animals in mid-stride, their long necks arched, their legs positioned with anatomical accuracy that would impress a modern wildlife illustrator. There were ostriches running in groups, their bodies rendered as simple, elegant curves. There were herds of cattle, dozens of individual animals painted with different coat patterns, spots and stripes and solid colors, as if the artist wanted to record each one as a distinct individual. There were human figures, thin and active, carrying bows, running alongside the animals, engaged in what were clearly hunting scenes. But the images that made Olmos's blood run cold, the images that would eventually make this site famous around the world, were the swimmers. There, on the wall of a cave in the driest place on Earth, hundreds of miles from the nearest puddle of standing water, were unmistakable depictions of human beings swimming. They were painted in a distinctive style, their bodies shown from above as if the viewer were looking down into clear water, their arms and legs spread in the unmistakable posture of people moving through liquid. Some appeared to be diving, others were floating on the surface. The artist had not merely drawn stick figures in water. The artist had captured the specific quality of human movement in water, the way the body elongates, the way the limbs extend, the way the head tilts back to breathe. This was not imagination. This was observation. Whoever painted these figures had watched real people swim in real water, in a place where water had not existed for thousands of years. Olmos called it the Cave of Swimmers, and the name stuck. The discovery electrified the small community of European explorers and geographers who were paying attention, though it would take decades for mainstream science to fully appreciate its implications, because those paintings were not art for art's sake. They were documentation. They were a record left by people who lived in a world so different from the one that existed above their paintings that the two might as well have been on different planets. The swimmers were real. The water was real. The giraffes and the cattle and the hunters were all real. And if all of that was real, then the Sahara had not always been a desert. The blank spaces on the map had not always been blank. Something had been there. Someone had been there. A whole world had been there, and it had been erased so completely that only these hidden paintings remained as proof that it had ever existed at all. The Cave of Swimmers raised a question that would haunt scientists for the rest of the 20th century. If people lived here, if they swam and hunted and painted with this level of sophistication, then where did they go? Where were their bones? Where were their tools, their settlements, the physical remains of their daily lives? The paintings proved they existed, but paintings alone could not tell us who they were when they lived, how they died, or what happened to their world. To answer those questions, someone would have to dig. Not in the canyons of the Gilf Kebbia, which had been picked clean by wind erosion over millennia, but somewhere else. Somewhere in the deep desert where the sand had buried things instead of stripping them bare. That place would not be found for almost 70 years, and when it was finally discovered, it was discovered entirely by accident, by a man who was not looking for humans at all, but for creatures that had been dead for 65 million years. In the year 2000, an American paleontologist named Paul Sereno was leading an expedition through the Sahara Desert in the landlocked West African nation of Niger. Sereno was a dinosaur hunter, one of the most prolific and successful in the world, and his team was in Niger searching for fossils from the Cretaceous period, bones that had been lying in the rock for 100 million years or more. The Tenerian is a good place to look for dinosaurs because wind erosion constantly strips away the surface layers of sand and sediment, exposing ancient rock formations that in wetter regions would be buried under hundreds of feet of soil and vegetation. The desert is, in a grim sense, a natural excavation machine, slowly peeling back the earth and revealing what lies beneath. Sereno's team was driving across a particularly flat, featureless section of the Tenerian when one of his colleagues, a photographer named Mike Hetwa, wandered away from the main group during a rest stop. He was walking across the sand looking for an interesting angle for a photograph when he noticed something white protruding from the surface. He bent down and brushed away the sand. It was a bone, but it was not a dinosaur bone. It was a human jawbone, and it was not alone. As Hetwa looked around him, he realized that the ground in every direction was scattered with bones. Human bones, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, protruding from the sand at odd angles, bleached bright white by centuries of sun exposure. Skulls lay half-buried, their empty eye sockets staring up at the sky. Long bones, femurs and tibias and humeri lay scattered across the surface, as if they had been tossed there by a careless giant. There were small bones too, the delicate bones of hands and feet, and most disturbingly, the tiny bones of infants and children. This was not a single burial. This was not even a small cemetery. This was a vast, sprawling graveyard, a necropolis of the ancient desert, stretching across the dunes for hundreds of meters in every direction. Sereno had stumbled upon the largest and most significant Stone Age burial ground ever discovered in the Sahara. They named it Gobeiro. Over the next several years, Sereno organized multiple return expeditions to Gobeiro, bringing teams of archaeologists, physical anthropologists, and geologists to systematically excavate and document the site. What they found there rewrote the human history of the Sahara in ways that no one had anticipated. The burials were divided into two distinct populations, separated by a gap of roughly 1,000 years. The older burials, the ones deepest in the sediment, belonged to the Kiffians, and they were extraordinary. The Kiffian skeletons confirmed everything that the scattered evidence had previously hinted at. These people were massive. The adult males averaged over 6 feet 3 inches in height, with some individuals reaching 6 feet 8. Their bones were dense and thick, their muscle attachment points enormous, their joints wide and heavily reinforced. These were people who had worked their bodies hard from childhood to death and had eaten well enough to support that effort throughout their lives. Their teeth, examined under magnification, showed wear patterns consistent with a diet heavy in fish and aquatic animals. Gritty sand particles from processing food near the lakeshore embedded in the enamel of their molars. But it was the way they were buried that truly shook the archaeologists. The Kiffians did not simply toss their dead into holes. They laid them out with deliberate care, positioning the bodies in specific orientations that suggested consistent ritual practice across the entire community. Some were buried in tightly flexed positions, their knees drawn up to their chests, their arms crossed. Others were laid out fully extended, their faces turned in the same direction, as if they were all looking toward something that mattered. Many were buried with grave goods, objects placed alongside the body for use in whatever existence the Kiffians believed came after death. Bone harpoons, the tools of their trade, were laid beside hunters. Jewelry carved from hippo ivory was draped around the necks and wrists of both men and women. Polished stone ornaments were scattered through the grave-like offerings. One burial in particular has become one of the most famous and emotionally devastating archaeological discoveries in the history of African prehistory. In a single grave, archaeologists found the remains of a woman and 2 small children, probably between 5 and 8 years old. They were not simply placed in the ground side by side. They were arranged in a deliberate embrace, the woman's arms encircling the children's bodies turned toward her as if seeking comfort. Their heads were resting on each other, and beneath their bodies, preserved by the extreme dryness of the deep desert sediment, was pollen, not just a few scattered grains, but dense concentrations of pollen from multiple flowering plant species. The woman and her children had been buried on a bed of flowers. Think about what that means. Someone, probably someone who loved them, someone who was shattered by their loss, had gone out into the green, blooming landscape that surrounded this ancient lake, had gathered armfuls of wildflowers, had carefully arranged those flowers in the bottom of a grave, and had then laid these three bodies down on top of them with the kind of tenderness that transcends time and culture and language. This was not the behavior of primitive savages struggling to survive. This was grief. This was love. This was a fully human emotional response to death, expressed through ritual and beauty, preserved in the dry sand for over 8,000 years until a team of scientists brushed away the dust and found it waiting. Gobero gave the Green Sahara its people. The cave of swimmers had given us their art. Now we had their bones, their tools, their rituals, and their grief. But Gobero also contained a mystery buried in its layers, because between the Kiffian burials at the bottom and a completely different set of burials above them, there was a gap, a layer of sterile, wind-blown sand with no bones, no tools, no charcoal, no evidence of human presence at all. For roughly 1,000 years, nobody lived at Gobero. Nobody was buried there. The lake had dried up. The people had vanished. And whatever happened during that 1,000-year silence would set the stage for the second act of the Green Sahara's extraordinary story. That 1,000-year gap in the Gobero record is not just a curiosity. It is the fingerprint of a catastrophe. Sometime around 8,200 years ago, the monsoon system that had been pouring rain onto the Sahara for over 2 millennia faltered. Not permanently, not in the final terminal way that would come later, but severely enough to plunge the region into a prolonged drought that lasted roughly 1,000 years. The mechanism was the same orbital wobble that had created the Green Sahara in the first place, but this time the wobble moved into a position that weakened the summer heating over North Africa just enough to pull the monsoon boundary southward. The rains did not vanish entirely from the continent. They simply stopped reaching as far north. The deep Sahara, the region where the Kiffians had built their lakeside empire, fell below the critical rainfall threshold that separated life from death. The effect on the landscape was devastating and in its own terrible way methodical. The Great Lakes began to shrink, not all at once, not in a single dramatic event, but steadily, remorselessly, year after year. Each dry season, the water level dropped a little lower than the year before. Each wet season, the rains returned a little weaker, a little shorter, a little less reliable than the last. The lush grasslands around the lake margins turned brown as the water table fell below the reach of the grass roots. The gallery forests along the riverbanks thinned and died as the rivers themselves shrank from flowing torrents to intermittent streams to dry, cracked channels choked with dust and the bleached skeletons of stranded fish. The fish populations in the shrinking lakes collapsed as the water became shallow and warm and oxygen depleted, too hot and too toxic to support the enormous Nile perch and the dense schools of tilapia that had fed the Kiffians for generations. Hippos crowded into the remaining pools, fighting for space, trampling the banks into reeking mud, fouling the water with waste until even those final refuges became death traps. Crocodiles, deprived of their aquatic hunting grounds, became stranded on drying mudflats, their bodies eventually mummifying in the heat, preserved in grotesque poses by the same aridity that was killing them. For the Kiffians, this slow-motion environmental collapse was an existential crisis on a scale they had no cultural precedent to understand. Their entire civilization was built around water. Their technology, their diet, their settlement patterns, their very physical bodies, everything about them had been shaped by thousands of years of living in an aquatic environment that was now disappearing beneath them. A people designed by generations of abundant protein and demanding physical activity to be large and powerful found themselves in a world where being large and powerful was suddenly a fatal disadvantage. Large bodies require enormous caloric intake just to function. A 6'6" Kiffian male might need 3,000 or more calories per day simply to maintain his body weight, far more in times of sustained physical stress like migration or conflict. When the fish vanished and the game migrated south and the wild plants withered into dust, those caloric demands could not be met. The very size that had made them lords of the Green Sahara now made them the most metabolically vulnerable organisms in it. They were giants in a world that could no longer feed giants. They left, they had no other choice. The archaeological record at Gobeiro shows no signs of violent destruction, no evidence of warfare or massacre or sudden catastrophe. The Kiffians simply stopped being there. They packed up whatever they could carry, left behind their heavy bone harpoons and their polished ornaments and their dead, and walked away from the lakes that had sustained them and defined them for over 2,000 years, following the retreating water southward toward the tropical belt, where the monsoon still delivered enough rain to keep the rivers flowing and the grasslands alive. Where exactly they went, whether they survived as a distinct people or were slowly absorbed into other populations over generations of intermarriage and cultural blending, whether any of their descendants walk the earth today carrying fragments of Kiffian DNA in their cells, we simply do not know. The sand closed over their settlements and their grave and their memories with the patient, implacable efficiency that the desert has always possessed, and the Kiffians vanished from history as completely as if they had never existed. For roughly 1,000 years, Gobeiro lay empty and silent. The wind blew sand across the abandoned burial ground, sealing the Kiffian skeletons under a growing layer of sterile, lifeless sediment. The lakes evaporated completely, leaving behind flat, cracked expanses of dried mud and crystallized salt that baked under a merciless sun. The Sahara returned to something approaching its modern state, a howling wilderness of rock and sand and gravel where nothing moved except the dunes themselves, creeping slowly across the landscape grain by grain in the relentless wind. It was as if the Green Sahara had been a dream, a brief hallucination of life and abundance in the middle of an eternal death. And now the dreamer had finally woken up to silence. But the Earth's orbital mechanics do not stop. They do not pause. They do not care about the human dramas and extinctions playing out on the surface of the planet they silently govern. The axis continued its slow, invisible wobble through the darkness of space, and roughly 7,000 years ago, it wobbled back into a position that once again strengthened the West African monsoon just enough to push the rain belt northward. The rains returned to the deep Sahara. Not as strongly as before, not quite as far north, not with the same overwhelming intensity that had created Mega Chad and the original continent-spanning lake system, but strongly enough. The dried lake beds at Gobeiro began to fill with muddy, brown water once again. The grasses crept back across the barren earth. The animals smelled the water and the green and migrated back northward. And following those animals, walking steadily out of the south with herds of a kind that the deep Sahara had never seen before, came a completely new people. They were smaller than the Kiffians. They were lighter, more gracile, built for endurance rather than raw power. And they brought with them an innovation so profound, so revolutionary, that it would alter the trajectory of human civilization across the entire African continent and eventually the world. They brought cattle that they owned. The Tenerians arrived in the Green Sahara roughly 7,000 years ago, during what scientists call the second phase of the African humid period. The rains had returned, the lakes had refilled, and the grasslands had spread across the ancient desert floor once again. But this second green period was not the same as the first. The monsoon was weaker, the rainfall less predictable, the dry seasons longer and harder. The lakes that had been vast inland seas during the Kiffian era were now smaller, shallower, and more vulnerable to fluctuation. It was still a livable landscape, still green, still full of water and grass and game. But it was a landscape that demanded a different kind of intelligence from its inhabitants. The brute force aquatic lifestyle that had sustained the Kiffians would not work as well in this more precarious version of the Green Sahara. The Tenerians understood this, either instinctively or through hard-won experience, and they brought with them a survival strategy that changed everything. They brought domesticated cattle, not wild aurochs, those massive, unpredictable and dangerous animals that still roamed the grasslands. The Tenerians arrived with cattle that had been selectively bred over generations to be smaller, more docile, and more manageable. Cattle that could be herded and directed. Cattle that would follow a human leader from pasture to pasture without bolting into the wilderness. This was not a minor innovation. This was one of the most consequential technological breakthroughs in the history of the human species. By domesticating cattle, the Tenerians had effectively created a portable, self-reproducing, self-maintaining food supply. A living larder that walked beside them wherever they went. The advantages were staggering. A single cow could provide milk every day without being killed, a renewable resource that delivered protein, fat, and essential nutrients in a form that could sustain a family through lean times. When water was scarce, cattle blood could be drawn from a living animal through a small, carefully placed incision in the neck, a practice that many pastoralist societies in Africa continue to this day. The blood provided iron and protein and could mean the difference between life and death during a drought. And when an animal was finally slaughtered, every part of it was used. The meat was eaten fresh or dried into jerky that could last for months. The hide was worked into leather for clothing, shelter, and containers. The bones were carved into tools. The sinew was twisted into cord. The dung was dried and burned as fuel in a landscape where trees were not always available. Even the horns were shaped into vessels and implements. A single cow was an entire economy compressed into a living, breathing, walking package. But for the Tenerians, cattle were far more than a practical resource. The relationship between these people and their animals evolved over centuries into something that went beyond mere husbandry. The cow became the organizing principle of their entire society, the axis around which their culture, their spirituality, and their identity revolved. We know this because they told us, not in words, but in images. Across the Sahara, on rock faces and in shallow caves, and on the walls of overhanging cliffs, the Tenerians and their cultural neighbors left thousands upon thousands of paintings and engravings depicting cattle. These are not crude sketches or abstract representations. They are detailed, careful, lovingly rendered portraits of individual animals. At the Tassili Enaja, a massive sandstone plateau in southeastern Algeria that is now one of the most important rock art sites on Earth, the sheer volume of cattle imagery is overwhelming. Panel after panel shows herds in motion, cows being milked by seated women, calves nursing from their mothers, bulls standing in aggressive poses with their horns lowered. The artists took extraordinary care to record the specific coat patterns of individual animals, painting spots and stripes and color variations with a precision that strongly suggests each animal was known personally, valued individually, perhaps even named. These were not interchangeable units of livestock. These were members of the community. The evidence from Gobeiro reinforced this interpretation in the most dramatic way possible. When archaeologists excavated the Tenerian burial layers, the ones sitting directly above the 1,000-year gap, they found something that stunned them. Buried alongside the human dead were the complete, carefully articulated skeletons of cattle. Not scattered bones discarded as food waste, but whole animals placed in the grave with the same deliberate positioning and ritual care that was given to the human bodies. The cattle were laid out in anatomically correct positions, their legs folded beneath them as if they were resting, their heads oriented in specific directions. In some grave, human and cattle remains were so closely intertwined that it was difficult to determine where the human burial ended and the animal burial began. This was not waste disposal. This was sacrifice. This was the ritual killing and interment of valued animals alongside their human companions, a practice that implies a belief system in which the bond between human and cow extended beyond death into whatever afterlife these people imagined. The cow was not just food. The cow was sacred. The cow was family. The cow was a bridge between the living world and whatever lay beyond it. This profound spiritual elevation of cattle in the prehistoric Sahara is not an isolated peculiarity. It is the deep, ancient root of a religious tradition that would eventually flower into one of the most powerful mythological systems the world has ever known. Because when these cattle-worshipping people were eventually driven out of the Sahara by the coming drought, many of them would migrate eastward to the Nile Valley, carrying their sacred cows and their sky-watching rituals with them. And on the banks of that great river, the cult of the cow would transform into the worship of Hathor, the cow goddess, who would become one of the most important deities in the entire Egyptian pantheon. But that migration was still centuries away. For now, the Tenerians had a more immediate concern. In this second, more fragile version of the Green Sahara, survival depended not just on having cattle, but on knowing exactly when and where to move them. And to solve that problem, they looked up at the night sky and began to build something extraordinary out of stone. 500 miles south of modern Cairo, deep in the Nubian desert, in what is now the far southern corner of Egypt, there is a place called Nabta Playa. If you visited it today, you would see nothing remotely inviting. It is a flat, baked depression in the earth surrounded by low, barren hills, the surface cracked and dusty and littered with small stones. There is no water, there is no vegetation, there is no shade. The temperature in summer regularly exceeds 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and the nearest permanent habitation is many miles away. It is, by every measure that matters to a living organism, a dead place. But roughly 6,000 years ago, when the monsoon rains still reached this far north, Nabta Playa was something else entirely. It was a playa, a seasonal lake, a shallow basin that filled with muddy brown water every summer when the rains arrived and dried back to cracked earth every winter when they departed. That cycle of filling and draining made it one of the most strategically important locations in the entire Green Sahara. The seasonal waters of Nabta Playa attracted enormous herds of grazing animals every summer, and the Tenerians followed them, driving their own domesticated cattle to the lush temporary pastures that sprang up around the lake margins as the waters receded. Year after year, generation after generation, they returned to this spot, making it a regular gathering place, a seasonal capital of sorts where scattered pastoralist bands converged to water their herds, trade goods, arrange marriages between families, settle disputes, and conduct the social business that holds any human community together. Over centuries, this repeated occupation left deep archaeological deposits at Nabta Playa, layers of animal bone, pottery fragments, charcoal and stone tools that told scientists the story of a people who were far more sophisticated than anyone had previously imagined possible for a group of semi-nomadic cattle herders in the prehistoric Sahara. But the most astonishing thing at Nabta Playa was not buried in the ground. It was standing on the surface. When archaeologists first surveyed the site systematically in the 1970s and 1980s, they found stones. Not random, naturally scattered stones, but large, deliberately shaped, and carefully positioned megaliths arranged in patterns that were clearly the product of intentional human design. Some of these stones were arranged in long, straight rows stretching hundreds of meters across the flat desert floor, like the remains of ancient avenues leading nowhere visible. Others were grouped in clusters, several large upright slabs planted firmly in the earth and surrounded by smaller rocks. And at the center of the complex, sitting on the highest point of ground at the site, was a circle. The stone circle at Nabta Playa is small by the standards of later megalithic monuments. It is roughly 12 feet in diameter, composed of upright slabs of sandstone, some standing perhaps 3 feet tall, arranged in a rough ring with internal sighting stones that divide the interior into distinct sectors. If you were not looking for it, if you did not know what it was, you might walk past it and dismiss it as a natural formation or a collapsed animal pen. But closer examination revealed something that forced the entire archaeological community to reconsider what they thought they knew about the cognitive capabilities of prehistoric Saharan people. The stone circle was an astronomical instrument. It was a calendar, and it was old. Radiocarbon dating of associated materials placed its construction at roughly 7,000 years before the present. That makes it at least 1,000 years older than Stonehenge. At least 2,000 years older than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It is one of the oldest known astronomical observing devices constructed by human beings anywhere on Earth. The alignments were precise and unmistakable. 2 pairs of upright stones within the circle created narrow windows, gaps between the slabs through which an observer sitting at the center could sight along a specific line toward the horizon. One of these alignments pointed directly to the position on the horizon where the sun rose on the morning of the summer solstice, the longest day of the year. This was not a coincidence. The probability of 2 pairs of stones accidentally aligning with the solstice sunrise in a circle this small is vanishingly low. Someone had deliberately set these stones to mark that specific astronomical event, with the kind of precision that requires careful observation over multiple years, probably many years, of patient watching, measuring, and adjusting. But the summer solstice alignment was only the beginning. Extending outward from the stone circle in multiple directions were the long rows of megaliths that had puzzled the initial surveyors. When astronomers analyzed these lines, they found that several of them aligned with the rising positions of prominent stars, including Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, and several stars in the constellation of Orion. These were not casual observations. These were systematic measurements of the night sky, encoded in stone, designed to be permanent, designed to last for generations, designed to serve as a reference tool that could be read by anyone who understood the system. The people who built Nabta Playa were not just watching the sky. They were mapping it. They were recording it. They were building a stone library of astronomical knowledge in the middle of a desert that would one day erase every other trace of their existence. And the reason they did it was not abstract curiosity or spiritual contemplation, though those may have played a role. The reason was survival, pure, desperate, life and death survival. Because in the precarious second phase of the Green Sahara, knowing exactly when the summer solstice arrived was not an academic exercise. It was the single most critical piece of information a pastoralist could possess. The summer solstice was the hinge on which the entire Tenerian survival strategy turned. In the precarious second phase of the Green Sahara, the monsoon rains arrived in a narrow seasonal window. Too early to Nabta Playa, and the basin would be dry, the surrounding pastures withered and brown, the cattle weakening with every day spent under the brutal pre-monsoon sun with no water and no forage. Too late, and the best grazing would already be taken by other groups, the water muddied and depleted, the opportunities for trade and social interaction diminished. The summer solstice, the longest day of the year, served as a reliable astronomical marker for the imminent arrival of the rains. It told the Tenerians, with a precision that no other natural indicator could match, exactly when to begin their annual migration northward to the seasonal pastures. The stone circle was not a monument. It was a survival tool. It was the difference between life and death, encoded in carefully positioned rocks. But building something like the Nabta Playa complex required more than just astronomical knowledge. It required organization. It required leadership. It required the ability to coordinate the labor of many people over an extended period of time toward a shared goal that would not produce an immediate, tangible reward. You cannot build a stone calendar in an afternoon. The megaliths at Nabta Playa, while not as massive as the sarsens of Stonehenge, were still substantial blocks of sandstone that had to be quarried, shaped, transporting, and erected with precision. Some of the stones associated with the broader complex weighed several tons. Moving them into position required the coordinated effort of dozens of people working together, pulling, levering, digging foundation holes, and carefully adjusting the final position until the alignment with the target star or solstice point was exact. This tells us something critically important about Tenerian society. These were not loose, disorganized bands of wandering herders with no structure and no hierarchy. They had leaders, individuals or groups who possessed the authority to direct collective labor and the knowledge to determine where the stones should go. They had specialists, people who had devoted years of their lives to watching the sky, tracking the movements of the sun and the stars, and accumulating the observational data necessary to design an accurate astronomical instrument. They had a system of knowledge transmission, a way of passing information from one generation to the next with enough fidelity that the astronomical alignments remained accurate and useful over centuries. In a culture without writing, this meant oral tradition of remarkable precision, mnemonic systems, apprenticeships, some organized method of ensuring that what the old astronomer knew would not die with the old astronomer. The implications of Nabta Playa extend far beyond the Green Sahara itself. When you stand at the site today and sight along the solstice alignment, you are looking at the oldest known evidence of systematic astronomical observation by human beings anywhere in Africa, and one of the oldest anywhere in the world. This was not a crude, approximate, good enough kind of astronomy. The alignments are precise enough that modern astronomers have been able to identify the specific stars that the stone rose targeted, accounting for the slow shift in stellar positions caused by precession over the intervening millennia. These ancient herders were watching the same sky that modern telescopes survey, and they were reading it with a sophistication that demands respect. Some researchers have gone further, arguing that the astronomical traditions developed at Nabta Playa and similar sites across the late Green Sahara represent the direct intellectual ancestry of the astronomical knowledge that would later characterize ancient Egyptian civilization. The argument is compelling on multiple levels. The Egyptians were famously obsessed with stellar alignments. The Great Pyramid of Giza is aligned to true north with an accuracy of less than 1/20th of a degree. Shafts within the pyramid point to specific stars. The entire layout of the Giza complex may correspond to the pattern of stars in the constellation Orion, the same constellation whose rising was tracked by the stone rose at Nabta Playa thousands of years earlier. The Egyptians organized their agricultural calendar around the heliacal rising of Sirius, the same star that appears in the alignments at Nabta Playa. The connection is not proven beyond all doubt, but the circumstantial evidence is powerful. A tradition of precise stellar observation, developed by cattle herders in the Sahara to predict the monsoon, may have been carried eastward to the Nile Valley when the desert dried out, and evolved over centuries into the architectural and calendrical astronomy of the pharaohs. But all of that lay in a future that the people of Nabta Playa could not see and would not live to experience, because even as they refined their stone calendar and tracked the stars with increasing precision, even as they gathered at the seasonal lake year after year with their sacred herds, the system they depended on was beginning to fail. The orbital wobble that had brought the monsoon back to the Sahara after the 1,000-year drought was not a permanent fix. It was a reprieve. The Earth's axis was still moving, still processing through its 26,000-year cycle, and it was now entering a phase that would weaken the monsoon not temporarily, not for a few bad decades, but permanently. The rains that the stones of Nabta Playa were designed to predict were about to stop coming, and this time they would not come back. The people who had built one of the oldest astronomical observatories on Earth, who had mapped the heavens and tamed the wilderness and elevated the cow to a sacred being, were about to watch their entire world turn to dust. The end of the Green Sahara did not arrive like a storm or an earthquake or a flood. There was no single catastrophic moment when the world cracked and the paradise shattered. It arrived slowly, incrementally, almost imperceptibly at first, the way a terminal illness begins not with a dramatic collapse, but with a slight tiredness, a loss of appetite, a cough that does not go away. Around 5,500 years ago, the orbital precession that governed the strength of the African monsoon crossed a threshold. The Earth's axis had wobbled far enough along its 26,000-year arc that the northern hemisphere was no longer receiving the extra summer solar radiation needed to sustain the deep low-pressure system over the Sahara. The atmospheric engine that had been pumping Atlantic moisture into the heart of the continent for nearly 5,000 years began to lose power. The monsoon boundary started to drift southward, retreating back toward the equator, pulling the rain belt with it like a curtain being slowly drawn closed. The first signs would have been subtle enough to dismiss: a rainy season that started a week later than usual, a summer that was slightly drier than the one before, a seasonal lake that did not fill quite as deep or last quite as long. The Tenerians, who had survived in this landscape for generations by reading its rhythms with extraordinary precision, would have noticed. They tracked the stars. They watched the water. They paid attention to the grass and the movement of the herds. They would have seen the small discrepancies, the tiny deviations from the pattern their stone calendar promised, and they would have worried. But for a while, probably for decades, the changes were small enough to absorb. The rains still came. The pastures still greened. The cattle still found forage. Life was harder, tighter, more anxious, but it was still possible. Then the changes stopped being subtle. The rainy season, which had once lasted 3 or 4 months, shrank to 2 months, then 6 weeks, then a few scattered storms that dropped less water than the earth could absorb before the sun burned it away. Lakes that had been reliable gathering points for generations began to fail entirely, their beds cracking into dry, white-crusted plains of salt and baked mud that shimmered in the heat like plates of hammered metal. The rivers stopped flowing. Not all at once, but section by section, drying up from their upper reaches downward as the water table dropped below the level of their beds. The grass died, not in patches, not in waves, but everywhere all at once, as if the landscape itself had decided to surrender. The savanna did not transition gradually into semi-desert. Recent climate studies have suggested that the Green Sahara's collapse involved a dramatic feedback mechanism that accelerated the process beyond what orbital mechanics alone would predict. Here is how that feedback worked. When the monsoon weakened and the vegetation began to thin, the ground that was exposed was lighter in color than the plant cover it replaced. Sand and bare rock reflect more sunlight back into space than dark green vegetation does. This is called albedo. Higher albedo means less solar energy is absorbed by the ground. Less absorbed energy means less heating of the air above the ground. Less air heating means a weaker low-pressure system. A weaker low-pressure system means the monsoon is pulled even further south, which means even less rain, which means even more vegetation dies, which means even more light-colored ground is exposed, which means even higher albedo. The system fed on itself. Each increment of drying caused the next increment to be worse. What might have been a gradual, centuries-long decline was compressed into something far more violent and far more rapid. Some climate models suggest that the final transition from green savanna to hyperarid desert happened in as little as 200 to 300 years. In a region the size of the Sahara that is breathtakingly fast. In human terms, it means that a child born into a landscape of grass and lakes and cattle could grow old and die in a world of nothing but sand and stone and silence. The effects cascaded through the ecosystem with merciless efficiency. As the grass died and the soil dried and cracked, the root networks that held the earth together disintegrated. Without roots, the topsoil was defenseless against the wind, and the wind came. Dust storms of staggering scale swept across the dying landscape, stripping away the thin layer of fertile earth that had accumulated over millennia and carrying it thousands of miles to the east, depositing it in the Mediterranean Sea and across the deserts of the Middle East. The Sahara was not just drying. It was being physically dismantled, its living skin ripped away and scattered to the winds, leaving behind nothing but the bare geological skeleton of rock and sand that we see today. The animals left first. The wild herds, the elephants and giraffes and antelope that had colonized the Green Sahara during its lush millennia, possessed no loyalty to the land. They followed the retreating grass southward, instinctively tracking the receding vegetation belt toward the tropical zones where the monsoon still delivered enough rain to sustain life. The predators followed the herds. Within a few generations, the megafauna that had filled the Saharan grasslands with sound and motion and life had simply moved on, reoccupying the same territories their ancestors had left thousands of years earlier when the rains first pushed northward. For the animals, the end of the Green Sahara was a migration, not an extinction. They went where the food was. But the Tenerians, bound to their slow-moving cattle and their ancestral territories and their sacred stone circles, could not move as quickly or as easily. For them, the end of the Green Sahara was not a migration. It was a catastrophe. Picture the scene from the perspective of a Tenerian elder standing at the edge of what used to be a lake. He is old enough to remember when this basin held water deep enough to swim in. He remembers wading into it as a boy, the cool shock of the water against his sun-heated skin, the slippery mud between his toes, the sight of his father's cattle standing belly-deep in the shallows, drinking contentedly while egrets perched on their backs and picked ticks from their hides. He remembers fish leaping in the deeper water, sending concentric rings rippling outward across the still surface. He remembers the sound of frogs at dusk, thousands of them, an overwhelming chorus that filled the evening air with a pulsating, rhythmic drone that felt like the heartbeat of the earth itself. Now he stands at the edge of that same basin and sees nothing but cracked, white-crusted earth stretching flat and featureless to the horizon. No water, no mud, no frogs, no egrets. The silence is enormous. The only sound is the dry wind hissing across the salt flat, picking up fine particles of dust and carrying them eastward in thin, ghostly streamers. His cattle stand behind him, thin and listless, their ribs showing through their hides. There is nothing for them to eat. The grass is gone. The nearest water is 2 days' walk to the south, and the scouts he sent in that direction came back with reports that it too was shrinking. This was the reality that confronted thousands of people across the dying Green Sahara as the desiccation accelerated. The landscape was emptying. The resources they depended on were evaporating, literally, into the hot, dry air. Staying meant watching their cattle die one by one, and then dying themselves of thirst and starvation beside the dried husks of lakes that had sustained their grandparents. There was no option but to move. But move where? The desert was expanding in every direction. To the north, the sand seas were impassable. To the west, conditions were no better. To the south, the surviving vegetation was already crowded with other displaced groups, humans and animals alike, competing for diminishing resources. The obvious, the only destination was east, because to the east, cutting through the desert like a lifeline, was a river. Not a seasonal stream dependent on local rains, but a massive, permanent, year-round flowing river fed by monsoon rains falling far to the south in the Ethiopian highlands. A river that had been flowing for millions of years and showed no signs of stopping. The Nile. The exodus eastward was not a single organized march. It was a slow, staggered, multi-generational process that played out over centuries as conditions deteriorated at different rates in different parts of the Sahara. Some groups moved early, pushed by particularly severe local droughts or drawn by rumors of abundant water to the east. Others stayed as long as they possibly could, adapting, shrinking their territories, concentrating around the last surviving water sources until even those failed. The routes they took are largely invisible to us now, erased by the same sand that buried everything else. But the broad pattern is clear from the archaeological and genetic evidence. People moved east and southeast. They moved toward the Nile Valley, and they moved in numbers that were large enough to fundamentally transform the population of the river valley within a few centuries. The journey itself was brutal. Between the dying Western Sahara and the Nile lay hundreds of miles of increasingly hostile terrain. The grasslands were gone or going. Water sources along the way were unreliable, present one year and dry the next. The migrants traveled with their cattle, which slowed them down considerably. Cattle cannot be rushed across a desert. They need water every day or two. They need forage. They need rest. A human being in desperate circumstances can cover 30 or 40 miles in a day if survival demands it. A herd of cattle being driven across arid country might cover 10 miles on a good day, 5 on a bad one. The migration was measured in weeks and months, not days. The toll in human and animal life along those routes must have been staggering. Skeletons of cattle and humans scattered along the migration corridors would have become a common sight, swallowed quickly by the advancing sand. Those who survived the crossing arrived at the Nile Valley carrying almost nothing except their cattle, their knowledge, and their traditions. They had lost their homes, their sacred gathering places, their seasonal lakes, the stone monuments their ancestors had built to read the sky. They had lost everything physical, but they carried the intangible things with them, the skills and beliefs forged over thousands of years of living in the Green Sahara. They carried their intimate knowledge of cattle husbandry. They carried their astronomical traditions, the ability to read the sky and predict the seasons. They carried their burial rituals, their spiritual reverence for animals, their organizational skills that had allowed them to coordinate the construction of megalithic monuments. They carried the memory of a world that no longer existed, a paradise of water and grass and sacred herds that was now being buried under an ocean of sand. And when they finally reached the banks of the Nile, exhausted and depleted and desperate, they found not the salvation they were hoping for, but a new challenge that was, in its own way, nearly as daunting as the desert they had just crossed. Because the Nile Valley 5,000 years ago was not the ordered, irrigated, productive agricultural heartland that it would later become. It was wild, it was dangerous, and it was about to become the most important place on Earth. The Nile Valley that the Saharan refugees encountered 5,000 years ago bore almost no resemblance to the Egypt of popular imagination. There were no fields of golden wheat. There were no mud brick villages with orderly irrigation canals feeding rows of carefully planted crops. There were no temples, no granaries, no administrators recording the harvest on papyrus scrolls. What there was, stretching from the southern cataracts all the way to the marshy delta at the Mediterranean coast, was a wild, narrow, incredibly dangerous river corridor cutting through one of the most forbidding landscapes on Earth. The Nile itself was, and remains, one of the most extraordinary rivers on the planet. It is over 4,000 miles long, the longest or second longest river on Earth, depending on how you measure it, and it flows through some of the driest terrain anywhere on the globe. For most of its length through Egypt and Sudan, the land on either side of the river is desert, true desert, with effectively zero rainfall. The river is an anomaly, a ribbon of water in a world of sand, fed not by local rains, but by monsoon precipitation falling thousands of miles to the south in the Ethiopian highlands and the Great Lake region of Central Africa. This means that the Nile floods every year, swelling dramatically during the late summer and early autumn months, when the distant monsoon rains are at their peak, then subsiding during the winter and spring. This annual flood cycle would eventually become the foundation of Egyptian civilization, but in its natural, unmanaged state, it was a force of terrifying destructive power. When the flood arrived, the river could rise by 20 feet or more in a matter of weeks. The water surged over the low banks and spread across the valley floor in a shallow, muddy, debris-laden sheet that could extend for miles on either side of the main channel. Everything in the floodplain was submerged. Any structures, any stores of food, any settlements that had been established on the valley floor were destroyed or buried under layers of thick, dark, nutrient-rich silt deposited by the flood waters. When the waters finally receded, they left behind a strip of extraordinarily fertile soil, black and rich, and ready to support explosive plant growth. But they also left behind vast areas of standing water, stagnant pools trapped in low spots and depressions across the floodplain, and these pools were breeding grounds for dangers both obvious and invisible. Crocodiles infested the Nile and its associated waterways in enormous numbers. The Nile crocodile is one of the largest and most aggressive crocodilian species in the world, capable of reaching lengths of 16 feet or more and possessing a bite force sufficient to crush the bones of a full-grown cow. They lurked in the shallows along the riverbank, in the reedy margins of oxbow lakes, in the stagnant pools left behind by the flood, nearly invisible until the moment they exploded from the water in a surge of muscle and teeth. For people accustomed to the open grasslands and clear lake shores of the Sahara, the dense, reedy, murky waterways of the Nile Valley must have been a landscape of constant dread. You could not see the bottom. You could not see what was waiting beneath the surface. You simply had to wade in and hope. Hippopotamuses were equally dangerous and far more numerous. Hippos are among the most territorial and aggressive large animals on Earth. They kill more people in Africa annually than any other large animal, including lions, elephants, and crocodiles. They are enormous. A large male can weigh over 4,000 pounds, deceptively fast on land, capable of outrunning a human over short distances, and lethally aggressive when they feel their territory is threatened. The Nile Valley in its natural state was prime hippo habitat, and the arriving refugees would have found the river and its associated channels and pools claimed and defended by massive pods of these animals. Then there were the mosquitoes. The stagnant pools left behind by the annual flood were perfect breeding habitat for malaria-carrying mosquitoes. Malaria, a parasitic disease transmitted through mosquito bites that causes recurring fevers, anemia, organ failure, and death, was almost certainly endemic in the Nile Valley long before humans arrived in large numbers. For people who had lived in the relatively dry, breezy, mosquito-poor environment of the Saharan grasslands, the dense, humid, insect-swarming air of the Nile floodplain must have brought waves of sickness that they had no previous experience with and no immunity to. The valley itself was narrow, in many places just a few miles wide, hemmed in on both sides by towering cliffs and plateaus of limestone and sandstone that marked the edge of the desert. Beyond those cliffs, in every direction was sand. The Nile Valley was not a broad, generous landscape that could absorb any number of newcomers. It was a thin, linear strip of habitable land, cramped and confined, and increasingly crowded as more and more refugees poured in from the dying Sahara to the west. Different groups, speaking different languages, carrying different traditions, herding different breeds of cattle, arrived over the course of centuries and were forced into close proximity with each other and with whatever indigenous populations had already been living along the river. The potential for conflict was enormous. The potential for disease was enormous. The potential for starvation, if the annual flood failed, or if the narrow strip of arable land could not produce enough food for the growing population, was enormous. The Nile Valley was not a promised land. It was a pressure cooker. And what happened inside that pressure cooker over the next several centuries would produce one of the most extraordinary civilizations in human history. What happened in the Nile Valley over the next several centuries was one of the most remarkable acts of collective human adaptation in the history of our species. The refugees from the dying Green Sahara did not simply arrive at the river and collapse into a disorganized, struggling mass of displaced people. They brought skills. They brought technologies. They brought organizational traditions that had been forged over thousands of years of surviving in one of the most demanding environments on Earth. And when those skills collided with the challenges of the wild Nile Valley, the result was not chaos. The result was civilization. The first and most immediate problem was the flood. The annual inundation of the Nile was both a blessing and a curse. The floodwaters deposited that extraordinary layer of rich, black silt across the valley floor, creating soil of almost unbelievable fertility. But the flood also destroyed everything in its path, and its timing, while roughly predictable, varied enough from year to year that being caught unprepared could mean the difference between a successful harvest and utter ruin. The Saharan refugees, however, arrived with a solution to this problem already built into their cultural DNA. They knew how to read the sky. The astronomical traditions developed at Nabta Playa and similar sites across the Green Sahara had given them a deep, sophisticated understanding of the relationship between celestial events and seasonal cycles. They knew how to track the solstice. They knew how to monitor the positions of key stars. And they quickly realized that one star in particular, Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, had a relationship with the Nile flood that was almost uncannily precise. Sirius disappears from the night sky for roughly 70 days each year as the sun's position moves close enough to it to drown it in daylight. Its reappearance on the eastern horizon just before dawn, an event called the heliacal rising, occurs at almost exactly the same time every year. And in ancient Egypt, the heliacal rising of Sirius coincided almost perfectly with the beginning of the annual Nile flood. The Saharan astronomers, already accustomed to using stellar events to predict the monsoon, recognized this correlation and built their new agricultural calendar around it. The heliacal rising of Sirius became the single most important date in the Egyptian year, the anchor point around which the entire cycle of planting, growing, harvesting, and preparing for the next flood was organized. This was not a discovery made from scratch by the early Egyptians. This was an adaptation of a skill set that had been developing in the Sahara for thousands of years. The stone circles of Nabta Playa found their ultimate expression not in more stone circles, but in the precise astronomical alignments of the pyramids and temples that would eventually line the Nile. The second critical contribution of the Saharan refugees was their cattle. The domesticated herds that had survived the crossing from the western desert became the foundation of early Nile Valley agriculture. Cattle provided the muscle power needed to break the heavy, wet, clay-rich soil of the floodplain. Before the invention of metal plows, which came much later, wooden implements dragged by oxen were the most effective way to prepare the soil for planting. Cattle also provided milk, meat, leather, bone for tools, dung for fuel and for fertilizing fields, and the social capital that had always been at the center of Saharan pastoralist culture. Wealth, status, and power in the early Nile communities were measured in cattle, just as they had been measured in cattle on the open savanna. The third contribution was organizational. Building a stone calendar at Nabta Playa required the ability to mobilize dozens or hundreds of people for a shared project. Digging irrigation canals along the Nile required the same skill on a much larger scale. Draining marshes, constructing embankments to control the flood, building granaries to store surplus grain, all of these tasks demanded coordinated collective labor directed by individuals who possessed the authority and the vision to plan and execute large-scale projects. The Saharan refugees, who had been organizing communal construction and seasonal migrations for millennia, brought this organizational capability with them. It merged with the demands of the Nile environment to produce something new, something that had never existed before in quite this form. A centralized, hierarchically organized society capable of mobilizing labor on a massive scale to reshape the natural environment for human benefit. The spiritual traditions of the Sahara were woven into the emerging culture as well, so deeply that they would persist for the entire 3,000-year span of ancient Egyptian civilization. The sacred cow of the Tenerians became Hathor, the great cow goddess of Egypt, one of the most ancient and powerful deities in the Egyptian pantheon. Hathor was the goddess of love, beauty, music, motherhood, and joy. She was depicted as a woman with cow ears, or as a full cow, or as a woman wearing a headdress of cow horns cradling a sun disk. The pharaohs were depicted being nursed by Hathor, drawing divine sustenance from her sacred udder. The imagery is striking when you know its origin. It is the final, polished, mythologized version of a bond between humans and cattle that began not on the banks of the Nile, but on the shores of vanished lakes in the middle of the Sahara, thousands of years before the first pyramid was even imagined. The cult of the cow, born in the Green Sahara, survived the death of its birthplace and became one of the cornerstones of Egyptian religion. And that is perhaps the most extraordinary legacy of the empire the sands swallowed. It did not truly die. It transformed. Meanwhile, back in the Sahara, the sand was completing its work. By 4,000 years ago, the transformation was effectively total. The Great Lakes were gone, evaporated into memory, their basins buried under dunes that had marched across them with the patience and inevitability of geological time. Lake Mega Chad, that immense freshwater sea that had once covered an area larger than all the Great Lakes combined, shrank to a fraction of its former size and kept shrinking. The modern Lake Chad, sitting in the same basin, covers less than 1% of the area that Mega Chad once occupied, and even that remnant is disappearing, reduced by drought and irrigation and climate change to a shallow, fragmented shadow of the titanic body of water that once defined the landscape of central North Africa. The rivers dried up and disappeared. The wadis that had carried torrents of monsoon runoff across the desert floor for thousands of years fell silent, their channels filling with wind-blown sand until they were indistinguishable from the surrounding terrain. Today, these ancient riverbeds are visible only from space, where satellite radar can penetrate the sand and reveal the underlying geological structures. From the ground, there is no trace of them, no suggestion that water ever flowed here. No hint that fish once swam, where sand now buries everything to a depth of hundreds of feet. The grasslands died and were buried. The gallery forests rotted and collapsed and were swallowed by the advancing dunes. The animals that had not migrated south died where they stood, their bones joining the geological record, occasionally surfacing thousands of years later when wind erosion peeled back a layer of sand and exposed a tusk or a jaw or a massive femur to the blinding sunlight before burying it again in the next storm. The ecosystem that had rivaled the Serengeti, that had supported millions of large mammals and tens of thousands of human beings, was annihilated. Not reduced, not diminished, not degraded. Annihilated. Replaced by the largest, most absolute, and most lifeless desert on the face of the earth. The human record was buried along with everything else. The settlements of the Kiffians, their lakeside camps with their deep middens of fish bone and broken tools, vanished under the sand. The elaborate grave of Gobeiro, with their flower burials and their sacred cattle and their towering skeletons arranged with such careful tenderness, were sealed beneath layers of sterile, lifeless sediment. The stone circle at Nabta Playa, which had guided the Tenerians to the seasonal rains for centuries, stood alone and useless under a sky that no longer delivered water, its alignments still pointing faithfully at stars that rose and set over an empty wasteland. The cave of swimmers in the Gilf Kebbia was sealed away in its deep canyon, its paintings preserved by the extreme aridity in perfect condition, a gallery of impossible images waiting in the dark for someone to find them and be astonished by what they depicted. The erasure was so complete that when modern Western civilization first began to seriously study the Sahara in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the idea that this desert had ever been anything other than a desert was treated as absurd. The Sahara was the Sahara. It was permanent. It was eternal. It was a geological fact as fixed and unquestionable as the existence of the ocean. When explorers like Olmsted found those paintings of swimmers and cattle and hunters in the deep desert, the scientific establishment was deeply skeptical. There must be some other explanation. The paintings must have been made by people who lived on the very edges of the desert and made long journeys inland to paint on cave walls for unknown reasons. The idea that people had actually lived here in the deep interior, surrounded by water and grass, was simply too fantastic to accept. It took decades of accumulated evidence to break that resistance. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica that recorded shifts in atmospheric dust, indicating when the Sahara was producing less dust because it was covered in vegetation. Marine sediment cores from the Atlantic Ocean floor that showed dramatic changes in the amount of Saharan dust reaching the sea at precisely the times the green periods were supposed to have occurred. Lake sediment cores from the surviving bodies of water in the Sahel that recorded pollen from species that could only have grown hundreds of miles further north. Radiocarbon dates from archaeological sites scattered across the deep desert that showed continuous human occupation for thousands of years during the humid period. Satellite radar imagery that revealed the ghostly traces of ancient rivers and lakes hidden beneath the sand. Genetic studies of modern African populations that showed patterns of migration and mixing consistent with a massive displacement event from the Sahara into the Nile Valley. Line after line of evidence, from discipline after discipline, all converging on the same extraordinary conclusion. The Sahara was green, people lived there, they built a civilization, and then the sand took it all back. The story of the Green Sahara is not just a fascinating chapter of prehistoric history. It is a profound warning about the fragility of the world we inhabit and the terrifying power of climate change to reshape the surface of the Earth on timescales that are, from a geological perspective, almost instantaneous. The Kiffians and the Tenerians did nothing wrong. They did not overgraze their pastures. They did not deforest their landscape. They did not pollute their waterways or burn fossil fuels or release greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. They were victims of a planetary process they could not control, could not predict, and could barely understand. The orbital wobble that gave them their paradise was the same orbital wobble that took it away, operating on a schedule that was utterly indifferent to the hopes and needs and prayers of the people living on the surface. The climate changed because the physics of the solar system dictated that it would change, and nothing the people of the Green Sahara did or could have done would have altered the outcome by a single day. And yet the story is not quite over, because the Earth's axis has not stopped wobbling. It continues its slow, invisible procession through space, tracing that lazy 26,000-year circle, and the mathematics of orbital mechanics tell us something extraordinary. The wobble is moving back. Slowly, imperceptibly, over the next several thousand years, the northern hemisphere will once again begin tilting toward the sun at the point of closest orbital approach. The summer solar radiation hitting North Africa will increase. The atmospheric engine that drives the West African monsoon will strengthen. And according to climate models that have been tested and refined over decades of research, the monsoon will eventually push northward again, back into the deep Sahara, back into the ancient lake basins, back into the dry, silent river channels that have not carried water for 5,000 years. The Green Sahara will return. Not in our lifetimes, not in our grandchildren's lifetimes, but on the timescale of geological process, it is coming. The orbital clock that turned off the rains is the same clock that will turn them back on. The desert is temporary. It has always been temporary. We just happen to be alive during one of its dry phases. That thought should give you pause, because if the Sahara can flip from green paradise to dead wasteland and back again on timescales of just a few thousand years, then every landscape on this planet is potentially temporary. The forests, the grasslands, the ice caps, the river systems that we build our civilizations around and assume will always be there, all of them are products of specific climatic conditions that exist right now but have not always existed and will not always exist. The Kiffians assumed their lakes would last forever. The Tenerians assumed their rains would always come. They were wrong, not because they were foolish or ignorant, but because the systems they depended on operated on scales that were larger than any human lifetime, larger than any human memory, larger than any oral tradition could preserve. They could not see the wobble. They could not feel the axis shifting. They could only watch, helplessly, as the world they knew slowly, irreversibly changed around them. There is one more thing worth thinking about as you lie here tonight, drifting towards sleep. The Sahara is 3.5 million square miles of sand and rock. Beneath that sand, buried under hundreds of feet of dunes in some places, there are things we have not found yet. We have barely scratched the surface, quite literally. Paul Sereno found Gobero by accident, walking across the sand looking for dinosaur bones. Laszlo Olmosy found the Cave of Swimmers by driving into a canyon and looking up. Nabta Playa was noticed because some of its stones were still protruding above the surface. But for every site we have found, there are almost certainly dozens, perhaps hundreds, that remain hidden. Entire settlements, entire graveyards, entire complexes of megalithic structures buried under the sand, waiting. Satellite radar has revealed the outlines of ancient rivers and lakes that have never been explored on the ground. There are regions of the deep Sahara that no archaeologist has ever set foot in, simply because they are too remote, too dangerous, too expensive to reach. The Green Sahara lasted for thousands of years and supported populations that may have numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The chances that we have found more than a tiny fraction of what they left behind are essentially zero. What else is down there? What other graveyards lie sealed beneath the dunes, with their flower burials and their sacred cattle and their towering skeletons? What other stone circles stand in the dark beneath the sand, their astronomical alignment still intact, still pointing at stars that rise and set above an empty desert with no one to read them? What other paintings wait in hidden caves, depicting worlds of water and grass and life that vanished so long ago that even the memory of them has been lost? We do not know. The desert keeps its secrets with a ferocity that matches its heat, and it gives them up only reluctantly, only by accident, only when the wind shifts and exposes a bone or a stone or a painted surface for a brief moment before burying it again. Think about the woman at Gobeiro, the one buried with her 2 children in her arms on a bed of flowers 8,000 years ago. Someone loved her, someone grieved for her. Someone took the time, in the midst of what must have been unspeakable loss, to go out into the green, blooming landscape and gather armfuls of wildflowers and carry them back and lay them carefully in the bottom of a grave, and then place her body and the bodies of her children down onto that fragrant, colorful bed and cover them with earth. That act of love, that gesture of tenderness in the face of death, survived for 80 centuries beneath the sand. It survived the death of the lakes and the death of the grasslands and the death of the entire world that she knew. It survived because the desert, for all its cruelty, is also the most perfect preserving medium on Earth. The extreme dryness that kills everything also prevents decay. The sand that buries everything also protects it. The Sahara destroys and preserves in the same motion, erasing the living world while embalming the dead one in perfect, silent, eternal stillness. As you close your eyes tonight, imagine the Sahara in the dark, not the Sahara of the daytime, all blinding light and crushing heat. The Sahara at night, when the temperature drops and the stars come out in numbers that people who live near cities can barely imagine. Thousands of stars, millions of them, filling the sky from horizon to horizon in a blazing, silent tapestry that the Tenerians once read like a book. The same stars they tracked, the same sky they mapped. The same constellations they encoded in stone at Nabta Playa, still wheeling overhead, still marking the solstice, still signaling the time when the rains should come. Beneath those stars, the sand stretches in every direction, vast and silent and patient. And beneath that sand, the bones of the empire sleep. The Kiffian giants with their massive frames and their bone harpoons. The Tenerian herders with their sacred cattle and their flower burials. The astronomers who built a calendar older than the pyramids. They are all still there, hidden in the dark, perfectly preserved, waiting for the wind to shift and the sand to move and the world to remember that they existed. Good night.